into the dust.
All right, so we're over the hump. We're up to letter N, which is just over the halfway point through the alphabet. And N is for Neanderthal. Now, I bet you think you know a lot about Neanderthals, but let's see if I can prove you wrong. You see, for the longest time, the word Neanderthal was basically a slur meaning stupid, primitive, or backward.
I realize we old-timers, we grew up. If you called someone Neanderthal, that was an insult. Like, they're still evolving Neanderthal.
Comparing someone to a Neanderthal helped convince them to change course and get on board with your public health message.
But thanks to archaeology, that stereotype is slowly changing. So let's start at the beginning. Who and what were the Neanderthals? Well, the Homo neanderthalensis are members of the hominid family, but we're not descended from them, us Homo sapiens. They're more like cousins of ours. In fact, we Homo sapiens actually lived side by side with the Neanderthals for a time and had some pretty intimate relationships with them, but more about that later.
Good morning, sunshine. Are you using my toothbrush?
So where did that ridiculous name Neanderthals come from? Well, the type specimen, and that's not the first ever found, but that's when a certain specimen of a species is whole enough and looked at by biologists who use it to define a new species and set out its defining characteristics. Well, that specimen for the Neanderthals was found in the Neander Valley in West Germany way back in the 1850s or 60s. So Neander Valley, hence Neanderthal. Now, a few inches shorter than modern humans, they're distinguished by their squatter, heavier build and those bulbous, prominent facial features. However, some of those silly-looking physical traits actually had evolutionary benefits that were adapted for the cold weather. You see that big wide nose? It could actually warm the air before it was breathed in. They also had specialized fat storage abilities as well, again, to guard against the cold weather.
You're not fat. You're big-boned.
That's what I said.
Now, the Neanderthals lived a long time ago. It's not exactly certain when they appeared. There's a lot of different estimates for that. But they went extinct about 40,000 years ago. Now, Homo sapiens, if you recall, they appeared between 300,000 and 200,000 years ago. So that's actually a lot of a long period of overlap. However, that overlap was effectively limited by geography. As we know, human beings came from Africa, but it took them a long time to spread out of the continent, and of course there was some back and forth movement as well. Well, the Neanderthals were concentrated in Europe, although their range seems to have spread all the way to the Far East in Central Asia to the Altai Mountains. And if that name sounds familiar to you, it should. If you remember, that was also the origin of the Scythian population that we discussed in a previous episode. Anyway, one of the things that archaeology has long since taught us is that the Neanderthals were not the stupid primitive cavemen that they're often portrayed to be, or at least compared to human beings at that time, no more or less stupid than we were. In fact, fun fact, they had a bigger brain than we do.
You know the human head weighs 8 pounds?
So how can I prove that to you? Well, some of this that I'm about to tell you is a little controversial based on the dating information, but the Neanderthals had a lot of the things that we humans associate with culture and civilization. For example, they had art. This art ranges from carved bones, like that bear bone we discussed in the cave in Poland a few episodes back when we were talking about microwear analysis, or similarly this carved raven bone. They had music. Check out this bone flute made out of a bear bone, just like the one in Poland. Now, if you want to see this, you can find it at the National Museum of Slovenia, which I must say, for being in such a small capital city, Ljubljana, it has an amazing collection of prehistoric stuff, going back from this bone flute tens of thousands of years, all the way up to the Iron Age and Roman times. They had technology, like their own style of lithic tools called Mousterian. Now, that name Mousterian comes out of a site called Le Moustier, where it was first identified. And just like with species, we use that term in archaeology when a type of something, maybe not is first found, but first really identified and characterized at a particular site. And then the type of artifact takes on the name of that site. Le Moustier is a cave in France, and maybe Spain have the heaviest concentration of Neanderthal. And incidentally, early humans had a different style of stone tools like those you see here. And when we see the changeover of that in the archaeological record, that's when we can identify the changeover in a site from Neanderthal to Homo sapien occupation. They made other useful tools. For example, the Neanderthals apparently wove plant fibers into rope, and that was discovered when we found a microscopic bit of that rope on a work stone flake. They also apparently collected, admired, and worked little bits of things that they considered precious, like seashells and fossils and quartz crystals. Not that different from modern humans. Think about, those curios cabinets in the early modern times, or even the funny little things we collect today, like refrigerator magnets. Now, some of these the Neanderthals apparently wore as personal ornamentation, like, for example, these bird talons that were found in a site in Croatia called Krapina. That's a cave site where Neanderthals lived that I visited when I was there. So the museum was a little bit tacky, but it was informative, and it was definitely cool to see the cave site where the Neanderthals actually lived. Definitely worth a visit if you're in or around Zagreb in Croatia. Now, another thing we can see at Krapina and some other Neanderthal sites is a little bit less savory characteristic of our Neanderthal friends, and that's that they apparently engaged in cannibalism, which we can tell from these butchered bones that were remaining.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
Well, isn't that special?
Now, some of this might be ritualistic defleshing of corpses, and there's that archaeological BS word, ritualistic. But anyway, we do see, even in later human contexts, some cultures do sort of remove the flesh from corpses as part of funerary practices and do things with the bones. However, given the context and the amount of this stuff that we find, it is likely that the Neanderthals did engage in some, shall we say, indulgences of the flesh.
You're delicious.
I don't indulge in pleasures of the flesh.
However, when they weren't eating each other, they actually may have been healing and caring for each other. And this is going to be some really cool application of archaeological science. You see, in studying human remains, one of the things you can look at is dental calculus. Now, not the math. Calculus is another fancy word for like tartar or plaque on your teeth. Well, in analyzing some Neanderthal teeth and looking at very, very carefully at the plaque buildup, researchers actually identified some plants that have known medicinal qualities, but no nutritional benefits and are actually somewhat unpalatable to eat. For example, chamomile, with its variety of known medicinal and palliative properties.
I'm just sipping on chamomile.
It's even been argued that the widely dispersed skeletal evidence showing trauma and injury that had actually been healed is evidence that Neanderthals actually cared for the sick and helped them to get better, which is what enabled these individuals to survive. Now, this brings up another unfortunate fact of Neanderthal living, which is that the skeletons show a very high incidence of stress, trauma, injury, and illness. In fact, it seems like more than 80% of them died before the age of 40. And yes, in studying bones, we can actually get a pretty good estimate of the age at death, especially the better preserved skeletons. So yeah, it was a stressful life. But even with that stress, the early death, that little bit of cannibalism, that was not enough to scare early humans away. Because we have multiple proof points, better I'd say even than videotape, of human to Neanderthal lovin', interbreeding.
Those dirty little messages.
Mike, you dirty little messenger.
First, we have bone and fossil samples of humans and Neanderthals, which are intermingled at the same sites, particularly in the Middle East. We have intermingling of those different types of stone tools that I mentioned earlier. But the most damning evidence we have of all is, of course, the DNA evidence.
What's up? In the case of 9-month-old Cairo, Kwan, you are the father.
And we've learned quite a lot from studies of both modern and ancient DNA. For example, a lot of people, many people, have trace amounts of Neanderthal DNA. Not lots. I mean, the highest end of different estimates I've seen is about 8%. If we look at different populations of human beings, the least amount is generally found in Sub-Saharan Africans who just have traces of a percentage point, and that probably didn't even come from Neanderthals directly, but instead from intermixing with other humans that had Neanderthal DNA. And oddly, the highest levels of Neanderthal DNA generally are found in East Asians. Now, why is that weird? Remember, the Neanderthals only made it to Central Asia. No traces of them have been found in East Asia. So that's probably just testament to the fact that humans migrated around a lot and this history of human beings is pretty complicated. However, remember, we're generally talking about small amounts, lower single digits. Now, that's the modern DNA. Of course, the ancient DNA has taught us quite a bit too. It seems like as of now, there's about 40 Neanderthal genomes that have been published. And oddly, over a dozen of those came from 2 sites in the Altai Mountains, those mountains, again, in the Mongolia-Russia area. And again, what's weird about that is that's the easternmost extremity of the Neanderthal sort of living range. What the study revealed, not surprisingly, is that a lot of the members of this small community were related. We had a father and a daughter, for example. Moreover, like most documented human societies, Neanderthals seem to have been patrilocal, meaning that it was the females, the women, that went to go live with the families and communities of their mates or husbands, although they probably didn't have the concept of marriage that we do. And now this part gets into one of the inherent weaknesses of the Neanderthals that probably was a huge factor contributing to their extinction. And that's that they had a very small population size and gene pool as a result. At any given time, there were only thousands or maybe low tens of thousands of them. Thus, they were not very genetically robust. They likely shared a lot of the same genetic vulnerabilities due to the limited gene pool. They lived in small, isolated communities of very sparsely populated, meaning that there was very likely a lot of, shall we say, close family relationships.
So if we have the same mother, tonight I'm gonna my brother.
And we know that's never good for the gene pool. Just ask the Habsburgs. So by the time modern humans came into contact with them, bad stuff was in store for the Neanderthals. Perhaps just like the Native Americans, they were vulnerable to disease, and there is some evidence of that. Maybe they were even killed in conflicts with humans, at least some of them were. Or perhaps they were just sort of bred out of existence in the face of better adapted Homo sapiens. In any event, it's probably a mix of all of these factors. So they seem to have made their last stand about 40,000 years ago in this area of northern Spain. Whatever the case may be, the fact is the Neanderthals do live on. They live on in us, in our DNA, even if it's only 1, 2, or 3% of it. So to summarize, if you've learned anything from this video, I hope it's that, number 1, the Neanderthals were not the primitive cavemen we often think them to be. In fact, they probably were not even really any less competent than Homo sapiens living at the same time, just less well-adapted from an evolutionary standpoint. And number 2, look at how powerful archaeology can be in reconstructing such ancient history. Look at all of the archaeological tools we've brought to bear. DNA analysis, skeletal analysis, dental analysis, lithics, isotopes, you name it, we've done it. And that, my friends, is the power of archaeology. The first story in today's archaeology news is actually very timely because we just did a whole talk about the Neanderthals and the ABCs of archaeology, and a big part of that was what actually happened to them. How did they disappear? Well, there's a new study that came out that sort of takes a different approach to that question. Rather than looking at the impact of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans, these researchers looked at the impact of modern humans in Neanderthal DNA, so sort of the reverse. Now, how did they do this? Well, according to the paper, there have been just 3 high-quality Neanderthal genomes that have been fully sequenced. Now, one of these comes from Croatia, in a place called Vindia Cave. So that's not the same as Krapina, which we talked about last week and I visited, but not too far away. The other 2 were from Russia, and one of these was from the Denisova Cave, and that's pretty exciting, because Denisova is a cave all the way in the Altai Mountains, which has now come up a number of times, and that was where a species of early hominins called the Denisovans was sort of identified. That's the type site. Now, the Denisovans are known from only a couple of bones, but they seem to be very related to the Neanderthals. And their existence was only confirmed in 2010 when there was a mitochondrial DNA test done of some of the bones that identified it as a specific species. Anyway, this paper gets really technical, so I'm going to break it down very simply. So to start, humans and Neanderthals are quite closely related, but definitely 2 given humans have much more in common genetically than 2 given Neanderthals, so that should be pretty obvious. When a man and a woman come together to make a baby, they each contribute their genetic material, so every person has 2 copies of each gene. Hence, the product of a human-Neanderthal union would be much more likely to have 2 different versions of a gene, known as heterozygosity, than would the child of, let's say, just 2 humans or 2 Neanderthals. Those would be more likely to have the same version of each gene. Starting from this logic, the team compared these 3 high-quality Neanderthal genomes with those of 2,000 modern humans, and they compared the level of heterozygosity among the 2 populations and used statistics to infer the level of interbreeding. And what they found was that modern humans contributed between 2.5 to 3.7 of the Neanderthal genome. Put differently, 1 out of every 30 Neanderthal parents was actually a modern human being. Moreover, they found a surprising lack of genetic variation in those Neanderthal genomes, which led them to estimate an average population of the Neanderthals about 20% smaller than previous estimates. Now, this is very important because if you recall, there were not a lot of Neanderthals at any given time. Their numbers were in thousands or, low tens of thousands, not millions. So that left them very spread out, thinly populated, and vulnerable, both physically and genetically. And finally, looking into the pairing of specific genes, the team estimated 2 periods of genetic intermingling between modern humans and Neanderthals. Remember, they actually coexisted in time, if not always in space, for hundreds of thousands of years. So one of these periods of genetic intermingling was between 100 and 120,000 years ago, the other 200 to 250,000 years ago, though this definitely doesn't preclude individual relationships that didn't leave much of an impact on the gene pool.
Hey, you know what I think we should do tonight?
What?
I think we should get some people together, huh? My friends, and your friends. We could go out and get some drinks or something.
Actually, tonight's not a very good night. I already have plans. It's kind of a girls' night.
And it's not surprising that there were only a few periods of intermingling found, because remember, the world at this time was very, very sparsely populated, and people and Neanderthals were hunter-gatherers, so they were doing a lot of moving around. So putting it all together, the not infrequent interbreeding, lack of genetic diversity, and small population of Neanderthals suggests that they very well may have just been bred out of existence. They were just absorbed by the modern human population. However, if you ask me, this is actually quite tenuous. One of those examples I think of researchers getting ahead of their skis. I've seen so many examples of very small sample ADNA studies jumping to conclusions and going seriously wrong, sometimes actually with modern-day consequences. In fact, there's an unpublished paper making the rounds now that says something pretty different. It looks at the other perspective at humans from the Paleolithic times till about 2,000 years ago, examining genomes. And what it found, what their findings suggested, was a period of interbreeding between human beings and Neanderthals, starting about 47,000 years ago and lasting about 7,000 years. That was more in line with previous research, which suggested, I believe, periods of interbreeding like 50 and 60,000 years ago. But to the layperson, the non-expert like me, having seen this movie before, this just sounds all very early stage and tenuous at this point. We need a lot more genomes and perhaps some better techniques before we really figure this one out. Trust me, having seen this movie before with aDNA, we gotta be careful. So, stay tuned. We're going to look at early human graves in Israel, as well as Neanderthal graves there, plus also in Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Uzbekistan. Because it seems this is where and when the practice of ceremoniously burying the dead began. Note, I'm avoiding the R word. So we're going back over 120,000 years ago, at a time when Homo sapiens, that would be us humans, were still kicking it in Africa, and the Neanderthals were hanging in their hometown of Western Europe. But then favorable climatic conditions, specifically more water, made the previously unpassable Sahara and Arabian deserts more hospitable, and this encouraged the Homo sapiens and the Neanderthals to get moving. So with the Neanderthals coming in from the northwest and the Homo sapiens coming from the south, from Africa, they met in what is today Israel. And as we know from the other episode, they did eventually start interbreeding, but now was not the time, not just yet. Now, prior to those dangerous liaisons, the two populations lived mostly separately. And I hate to reinforce old caveman tropes, but they actually seem to congregate around specific caves. However, it doesn't always seem that these early hominins, the early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, actually lived in these caves. Often it appears that they just sort of used them for ceremonial and symbolic, I'm avoiding the R word, practices like painting or burials.
Even in most primitive man, the need to create was part of his nature.
And it's this latter part, burials, that we're going to be talking about right now, because it seems like this is the first time and place that both humans and Neanderthals actually started burying their dead. Of course, there were early human burials in Africa. There's a few very early ones of young children, and there were Neanderthal burials in Europe. But those actually came later than these in Israel, which again seem to have happened about 120,000 years ago. And hence a team of researchers got together and examined these two species burial rituals to sort of compare and contrast what they did. Now, before you get all excited, don't expect their funerals to be anywhere near as elaborate as ours are today.
Man did not have the time for complicated rituals. Funeral services were often brief.
And examining 17 separate sites, the team came up with some pretty interesting findings. First, although both humans and the Neanderthals used caves for burials, the Neanderthals seemed to prefer the inside of the caves, whereas the humans seemed to bury their dead sort of out on front in the porch. Both buried men and women of all ages, though the Neanderthals were more likely to bury infants. They also interred grave goods with the dead, and mostly animal products like bones, antlers, shells, and the like. although the specific selection varied somewhat between the humans and the Neanderthals. The body positions were largely similar, although the Neanderthals had a little bit more variety in how they positioned the dead. But one big difference is symbolic. The Neanderthals often seemed to put a shaped rock like limestone underneath the heads of the deceased as a kind of pillow, sort of to give them comfort in their repose.
10,000 years will give you such a crick in the neck.
Humans, on the other hand, interred seashells like this conch shell, as well as ochre, which is a kind of a clay used for pigments that are sort of earth tone, and sometimes they colored the shells with the ochre. Now, they buried these in and around the graves, and if you think about it, way back in the day, if you're not living on the shore, these would be rare and valuable goods, these seashells. Now, the really interesting question is how this idea of burying the dead and in relatively similar ways come about among these two populations simultaneously. The authors posit that this was due to competition. The humans and the Neanderthals were suddenly thrown into this space together, and they were competing for food and resources. So these graves were sort of a way to mark their territory, like, this is my cave. Now, studying early medieval England, this is in fact familiar to me, as at different points in that period, it was posited that graves which were sort of prominent with mounds and high places were also placed to demarcate the territory of a tribe or a small chiefdom. However, I don't know why we have to be so pessimistic. Maybe this was just an instance of these two populations learning from each other. Now, I'm not sure whose bright idea this would have been first, but after all, there are just benefits to burying the dead. For example, not having smelly corpses rotting around where you are or carrying them far away and wasting that energy. And if you remember, the Neanderthals were at least occasionally cannibalistic. So perhaps the humans were just showing them a better way to sort of dispose of the dead.
Now I'll stop you with bread. It don't hurt, because you're dead, and you're certainly lucky you are.
So, though the competition explanation certainly does make sense, I'm not sure why knowledge sharing and cultural exchange aren't on the menu too, right alongside the cannibalism. This can be a feel-good story too. After all, we know that these two populations would later come to occasionally mate. So just because they're living separately at this point doesn't necessarily mean they didn't get along. Perhaps they just had different beauty standards. Alright, so that's our archaeology news for today, coming to you from the Near East. Okay, so moving on to Poland, where a bear bone found in a cave way back in the 1950s is yielding new insights thanks to a paper recently published by some local researchers. Now, this bone was found in a cave that was rich with the remains of other ancient animals, wolves, foxes, you name it, dozens of varieties. This cave is in a karst region of Poland, and karst is that limestone that creates those lovely mountains in places in the world like Guilin, China, or is perfect for forming caves, like in parts of Slovenia. If you look, they even put a castle into this one. It was determined to be the rib of a bear, and you can clearly see those scratches, which were definitely made by intelligent life forms, some kind of a hominid. And based on the stratigraphic layer it was found in, and the faunal remains it was found with, we know that this bear was from approximately 115,000 to 130,000 years ago, when it's well attested that our friends the Neanderthals inhabited this region. And so, based on that dating way back to what was called the Eemian period, and the regularity of those scratch marks, this piece of bone was named probably the earliest piece of representational or symbolic art in Europe, and it therefore became a very famous item. However, there's one problem. Those judgments were all made on the basis of simple observation. The bone itself was never really subjected to any rigorous scientific observation, so that's exactly what this team did. Now, the paper isn't quite clear on this point, but that actually was misidentified as a rib bone. It was not a rib bone of a bear. It was the radius of a bear. But what isn't clear to me is if this current team was the one who made that correction, or if that had already been done earlier by other researchers. Moreover, based on the lack of fusion in the bones and traces of the muscle attachments, the team determined that this was a juvenile bear, probably a brown bear, which still roam Europe today. I actually saw one in Slovenia. Anyway, they subjected the bone to lots of high-tech analyses using advanced microscopes, laser scanning, microphotogrammetry, basically taking super close-up 3D images. And using these techniques, they were able to get really, really precise measurements of those scratches, like the depth, the angles, etc. Then they did a bunch of experimental archaeology to see if they could replicate these cut marks. And what did they find? First of all, given the regularity, they determined this was done in one sitting. And there was also no useful purpose to making the cut, so this isn't consistent with butchering. Second, they determined that the cut marks were made with a retouched stone tool, and based on our K for napping that we did this week, you know exactly what that means, a retouched stone tool. And finally, they were able to determine, based on the angle of the cut marks, that it was a right-handed person that made them. It's amazing how much science can teach us about the minute details of technology and activity long ago. However, I do have one problem with this paper, which is that I think it's overinterpreted. I think they're making a little bit too much of a stretch in their determination about what this means. Now, I'm not casting aspersions on this particular team, but I do, again, think it was a little bit of a stretch to say that this is definitely an example of representational or symbolic artwork. And it's not because I don't think Neanderthals were capable of that. In fact, we know they were. They painted stuff with pigments for ornamental purposes. In fact, some of those cave paintings we've discussed a few times, those were made by Neanderthals, like this one here in Spain. So it's not that I think Neanderthals were incapable of making this type of artwork. Yet, just because these cut marks were regular, deliberate, and done with no particular utilitarian purpose, does not necessarily make them an example of representational art. Now, how do I know this? I sort of unwittingly did an ethnographic experiment myself. Now, when I was a kid, probably 8 or 9 years old, my parents bought me my first knife for fishing and sailing and other outdoor kind of stuff. And I remember one day just sitting there kind of by an old table at my house, just kind of scoring it with a knife, making regular tick marks. Now, these marks were deliberate, they were regular, and they were done in one sitting without any utilitarian purpose in mind. But were they art? No. I was actually just bored. I wasn't even paying attention to what I was doing. And guess what? My parents were not happy with the results of my labors. And that's something that's often overlooked about past times. Life must have actually been really boring. Other than hunting, sleeping, eating, there really wasn't a whole lot to do. There weren't very elaborate cultures and rituals that took up a lot of time in non-necessary type of stuff. So people had a lot of time on their hands to play with their stone tools and to make their stone tools. So on this piece of bone, that's very well what could have been going on. Someone was just bored and making cut marks on the bone. So I'm not saying the team who interpreted this is wrong. I'm just saying I'm skeptical. And that's how you critically read the archaeology news. You're allowed to use your own brain. Don't just blindly trust the experts. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.